What would you do if a powerful man handed you the keys to a ruin in front of a laughing room and called it a wedding gift he had no intention of honoring? In the autumn of 1852, in a provincial corner of England, a young woman named Claire Cole was publicly saddled by a duke with a shuttered country seat called Ashby Hall, a half-collapsed pile everyone in 3 counties agreed was worth less than the paper the deed was written on. But what happened inside those damp rooms over the year that followed would turn every laugh in that room to silence. Settle in. Pour something warm. Let us know where you're watching from, and stay close, because this one earns its ending slowly. The coach set her down at the crossroads 2 miles short of the village, because the driver would not risk his axles on the sunken lane that led the rest of the way in. Claire Cole climbed down without complaint. She was 23 years old, thin from a long spring of sitting up with a dying aunt, and her mended boots took the mud with the resigned patience of boots that had taken worse. She carried 1 trunk, a leather satchel of papers, and a folded oilskin cloak that had belonged to her father. Nothing else in the world was hers. The rain had stopped an hour before. The hedgerows dripped. Somewhere behind the low gray clouds the sun was setting, and the light that filtered through the wet hawthorn was the color of tarnished brass. Claire set the trunk down on the verge and looked once in each direction, as if a person might be waiting who would take pity and offer a cart. No one was waiting. No one had said they would be. She lifted the trunk again and began to walk. The lane climbed and climbed again between banks of dying bracken. A rook coughed from a bare ash. Now and then she stopped, set the trunk on the wet grass, pressed the small of her back with 1 reddened hand, and went on. She did not weep. She had spent her tears in London, in a marble drawing room, standing very straight while a man in a plum-colored waistcoat announced her wedding portion in front of 80 guests, and then, laughing, unrolled the deed to a house she had never seen and pressed it into her hand as though he were giving her a joke. The Duke had a name and a title and a mother who had wanted him to marry any of 6 other women, and Claire, whose father had once been useful to his father and whose family papers had once made his family rich, had been the last obstacle to be tidied away. He had chosen his tidying with care. Ashby Hall, everyone said. Ashby Hall, which no one had lived in for 30 years. Ashby Hall, which the estate books had written down as uninhabitable in 1841 and had not troubled to look at since. He had signed it over to her in place of the settlement she was owed, in front of witnesses, with a bow so deep it was almost a curtsy, and the room had laughed because laughing was safer than sympathy. Then he had married a viscount's daughter 3 weeks later and forgotten Claire's name. She had not forgotten his. By the time the chimneys of the village showed themselves against the last of the light, her arms were shaking and the trunk had rubbed her palms raw through her gloves. She had walked the 2 miles in an hour and a quarter. She had not once put the trunk down long enough to sit. A woman in a gray shawl watched from the doorway of the first cottage. A boy driving a goat stopped to stare. By the time Claire reached the inn at the crossroads square, 3 men at the trough had turned to look, and one of them was already grinning behind his hand. "Ooh, that'll be the new mistress of Ashby," he said, not softly. "Come to take the damp in her lungs." "Poor creature," said another. "Best give her a spade for a welcome. She'll want it for the graves." Claire did not turn her head. She set the trunk down on the flagstones, drew a breath that hurt her ribs, and asked the innkeeper's wife in a level voice for a room for the night and directions to the house in the morning. The innkeeper's wife, a broad, kind woman with flour on her forearms, looked at her a long moment before she answered. "You mean it then?" she said. You mean to go up there? I do, said Claire. Child, the woman said, gentler than the men outside. There's no roof on the West Range. There's water in the cellars up to a man's knee. There's a hole in the chapel floor a horse fell through in my mother's time. The last steward hanged himself in the gatehouse. Nobody's set foot past the lodge in 6 years, but boys after birds' eggs, and them not twice. I heard all of it in London, Claire said. I heard worse. And still you come. I have nowhere else. The woman wiped her hands slowly on her apron. Then God keep you, miss. You'll want candles. You'll want a kettle. You'll want a man with an axe and another with a billhook. And you'll not find either who'll take your coin until they've seen the color of it twice. She paused. There's a fellow called Harding by the smithy will lend you a barrow. Tell him Mrs. Peake sent you. He won't laugh at least. Thank you, Claire said. She ate a bowl of barley soup at a table by the fire while the rain started again, and the men from the trough came in and looked at her sidelong and said nothing to her face. She heard the word castle spoken twice, both times as though it were the punchline of a joke everyone had already told. She heard the phrase the Duke's little charity said once, low, and the laughter that followed was the kind that dies quickly because it has been ashamed of itself halfway through. She went up to a narrow room over the stable yard and lay on the coverlet in her clothes because she did not trust the sheets to be dry. She held the deed to Ashby Hall on her chest with both hands, the way a child holds a doll, and she stared at the ceiling until the rain sounded like something friendly. In the morning, she would go and see what she had been given. The lane to the gates ran a mile out of the village between 2 hedges that had not been laid in a generation. Blackthorn had closed over it in places so that Claire had to duck and hold her bonnet with one hand. Mrs. Peake had lent her a lantern, though it was already full daylight. The woman had said, without smiling, that she might want it for the inside. Claire carried it, looped over her wrist. The barrow the smith had lent her rattled behind, carrying her trunk, a sack of coals, a loaf, 2 candles, a tin of matches, and a small brown kettle. The gatehouse rose out of the hedge before she was ready for it. It was a squat block of dark stone with narrow windows, and a slate roof half slid into the ivy. One of its 2 great oak doors hung open on a single hinge. The other had fallen inward at some point, and lay across the flags of the archway like a felled tree. Above the arch, cut into the stone, was a coat of arms she did not know, worn nearly smooth by 2 centuries of weather, and beneath it a single word she could just make out. Ashby. She stopped in the arch and looked through it at the drive. The drive ran a 1/4 mile between an avenue of limes that had grown into each other overhead, so completely that even at midday, the tunnel beneath them was the color of an old bruise. At the far end of the tunnel, framed like a picture in a rotted frame, stood the house. It was larger than she had let herself imagine. It was worse than she had let herself imagine. 3 stories of gray stone, a long central block with a pair of wings, a battlemented parapet along the roofline with 3 stones missing that she could count from where she stood. The chimneys, of which she counted 11, were black with old soot and green with new moss. Half the windows on the ground floor were boarded. Most of the windows on the upper floors had lost their glass and stared out of the stone like empty sockets. Ivy had climbed to the 2nd-story sills on the west end and was working on the 3rd. A young ash tree was growing out of a crack in one of the gables. Claire stood in the arch a long time. She did not cry. She had thought she might. Instead, a strange steadiness settled into her. The steadiness of a person who has finally seen the size of the thing set against her and found that it is only a size, and sizes can be worked at. She wheeled the barrow through the arch and started down the avenue. Halfway along, at the point where the limes were thickest and the light thinnest, an old man was sitting on a fallen stone at the edge of the drive, as though he had been placed there for her to find. He wore a dark coat gone rusty at the seams and a black felt hat with the nap rubbed off. A hazel stick lay across his knees. He watched her come without surprise, as if he had been told she would arrive at that hour, which was impossible because she had not known herself. She stopped level with him and set the barrow down. "Good morning," she said. "Miss Cole," he said. His voice was dry and formal and old. "Welcome home." She did not ask how he knew her name. Everyone would know her name by now. "Home is generous," she said. He looked past her at the house and past the house, as though at something behind it she could not yet see. "They gave you the shell," he said, "and thought they gave you nothing. Mind the west cellar, mind the chapel floor, and when the year turns, look under the north hearth." "Under the north hearth," she said. But the old man had already risen and was walking away down the drive the way she had come, his stick tapping the mud, and though she called after him twice, he did not turn. She stood a moment longer among the limes with her hands on the barrow and the taste of iron in her mouth. Then she went on toward the house. What kind of gift is a ruin? What could an old man mean by a hearth? And why would a duke give away, in front of 80 witnesses, a house he had not himself set foot in for a decade? If you're already leaning in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest. Because the moment Claire pushed open that great front door, the story you think you're hearing begins to change. Claire set her hand on the door. The wood was oak, black with weather, banded with iron studs the size of a child's fist. She pushed. It yielded half a foot on hinges that groaned like a beast in a stall, then stopped against something on the flags inside. She did not force it. Whatever waited beyond would wait another hour. She turned back to the barrow first, because a woman with nothing must keep the little she has near her hand. She was lifting the sack of coals when she heard hooves on the drive. They came at an easy walk, unhurried, the sound of a man who did not fear the ground he rode over. Claire straightened and set the sack down again. A bay horse and a rider in a green coat came through the tunnel of limes and drew up not 10 paces from her. The rider was fair, 40 perhaps, ruddy from weather and wine both. He did not dismount. He looked at the barrow, at her mended boots, at her face, and then, longer than at any of these, at the house behind her. "Miss Cole," he said, and touched his crop to the brim of his hat. "Ridley, agent for the Marsden estate over the hill. His lordship sends his compliments and a caution." "A caution," Claire said, "that you not remove anything of value from the fabric of the house, ma'am. Chimney pieces, panels, lead from the roofs. There is a schedule kept from 40 years back, and his lordship, in kindness to his cousin the Duke, means to keep it honest." He smiled without warmth. "Of course, in a house like this, one hardly knows where fabric ends and firewood begins." Claire held his eye. "There will be no confusion, sir." "I am sure not." He looked past her at the boarded windows, the ivy, the sapling in the gable, and his mouth moved in a small private amusement. "You are a brave young woman, ma'am, or a stubborn one. In the country, we scarcely tell them apart." He tapped the crop against his boot. "If you find yourself needing a cart to carry you back to the coach road, you have only to send word. Marsden's men are down the hill and will come at a canter." "I have no need of a cart," Claire said. "Not yet," said Ridley. He turned the bay's head and rode back the way he had come, whistling under his breath, and did not look behind him. She stood watching him go until the sound of the hooves was swallowed by the limes, and only then let out the breath she had been holding for the whole small conversation. She knew that voice. She had heard it in a marble drawing room 3 months before, worn by a different mouth. It was the voice a man used when he had already decided a woman was a joke, and he was only waiting to see how much of the joke she would accept. In London, it had cost her the wedding portion she was owed. Here it cost her nothing yet. The village had used a plainer voice. She had heard it as she walked down from the inn that morning behind the barrow. A woman calling to another over a hedge that the Duke's poor bride was going up to the ghost house, and would they lay wagers on how long? She had heard a man at the smithy tell Harding, in the tone one used with a friend, that a soft-handed girl would not last the first frost in that damp. She had heard, from behind her as she passed the churchyard wall, a child asking its mother if that was the lady who lived with the Graves now. The mother had hushed the child. The child had asked again. Claire lifted the sack of coals and set it against the step. She lifted the trunk down. She lifted the kettle and the loaf and the candles and the tin of matches, and set them each in their turn against the door. Then she stood a moment with her raw palms open at her sides, and looked at the front of Ashby Hall, at the 11 chimneys and the sapling in the gable and the ivy climbing to the 3rd-story sills, and remembered the old man's words on the drive as though he had just spoken them. They gave you the shell, and thought they gave you nothing. She did not know yet what he had meant. She meant to find out. She put her shoulder to the door. It gave grudgingly an inch and then another, wood scraping over grit and swollen board, until the gap was wide enough for a thin woman to slip sideways through. Claire slipped sideways through. The air inside was older than any air she had ever breathed. It smelled of damp plaster and cold soot and something sweeter beneath, like apples left too long in a loft. Light came from 3 places only. The crack behind her, a broken pane high in the stair window that let a shaft of pale gray fall on the flags, and a splintered board in the boarded window of what had once been the hall's east parlor, admitting a coin of daylight the size of her palm. The rest was dusk at noon. She stood in a great entrance hall paved in black and white stone. A staircase rose ahead of her in 2 flights, its banister carved in a pattern of oak leaves, its treads furred with the dust of 30 years. To her left, the doorway to a long room stood open, and beyond it, she could see the shapes of shrouded furniture, like sleeping animals under sheets gray with dirt. To her right, another doorway showed a passage that lost itself in dark. From somewhere above, a slow, steady drip counted seconds she could not see. She walked forward until she stood in the coin of daylight and turned once, slowly, letting her eyes learn what the house wanted her to see first. Plaster had come down from the ceiling in patches shaped like continents. A brass chandelier hung crooked from a chain that had rusted through in 2 links. The banister at the foot of the stair had been carved, and where a hand had gripped it for 100 years, the varnish was worn to bare wood. Someone had lived here. Someone had left. The house remembered both. She went back out to the barrow and brought in the coals, the trunk, the kettle, the loaf, the candles, and the matches, 1 load at a time, and stacked them just inside the door because she did not yet know which room in the house was hers. By the light of the 2 candles, she found a small chamber off the passage that had once been a housekeeper's room and was now only 4 walls, a fireplace, and a rotted press bed under the window. The fireplace drew. She proved it with a twist of paper from the satchel and a splinter of dry board, and the smoke went up honestly. She built a fire of splinters and a very little coal, and set the kettle on a bar someone had left across the grate for that purpose in another century. The kettle took an hour to sing. In that hour, Claire swept the flags of the housekeeper's room with a broom she found leaning behind the door, unrolled her father's oilskin cloak on the floor before the hearth, opened the trunk and laid a folded blanket on top of the cloak, and set beside them the deed to Ashby Hall in its leather case. She did not unpack anything else. She would learn the house before she gave it more of what she owned. Night came into the room from every direction at once. The window darkened first, then the corners, then the doorway to the passage, until only the fire and the 2 candles held. Rain began again on the roofs above, and Claire heard it move through the house room by room like a lodger looking for a place to lie down. A patter here, a steady drum there, a distant slap against boards where a ceiling had gone. Somewhere far off, in what she thought might be the West End, water fell in a rhythm too heavy for rain, and she remembered the elder's voice, mind the west cellar, and did not go to sea. She ate half the loaf. She drank hot water from the kettle because she had no tea. She lay down on the oilskin before the fire in her clothes, with the deed under her hand and the blanket over her, and listened. The house did not sleep. It creaked when the wind changed. It sighed when the rain grew heavier, and then eased. Somewhere above her, a shutter tapped a slow patient 1-2, 1-2 against a frame. In the chimney, a bird moved once and settled. She heard, or thought she heard, the tick of something dry contracting in a distant room as the fire's small warmth reached it through the walls, and she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that the house had been waiting to be heard. She closed her eyes. She meant to sleep for an hour and rise to feed the fire. She slept for 6. When she woke, the fire was a red heart in gray ash. The candles were guttered stubs, and pale dawn was climbing the wall opposite the window in a slow blue tide. Something in the corner of the room, in the corner she had not swept, caught the first light and gave it back dully, and Claire lay a moment on her side and looked at it before she understood she was looking at it at all. What Claire had seen in the corner was a slow, small gleam no larger than a shilling, low against the skirting where the wall met the floor. She lay a while longer, waiting to be sure her eyes were awake. The gleam did not move. It did not brighten and dim as a spider might make a fleck of dust brighten and dim. It lay flat and steady, taking the blue dawn and giving it back like the eye of an old ring. Claire sat up. She wrapped the blanket round her shoulders, fed the fire 2 splinters and a knuckle of coal, and crossed the flags in stockinged feet. She knelt in the corner. The gleam came from a thin flat, something set into the wood of the skirting itself, no bigger than the nail of her thumb. She thought first it was a nail head, and then she thought it was a coin worked into the board by some old joke of a carpenter. And then, when she had brushed away 30 years of soft gray dust with the pad of her finger, she saw it was a letter. A brass letter. The letter A, no taller than a barley grain, hammered flush into the grain of the oak. Beside it, half a hand's breadth along the skirting, was a second letter, the letter H, and beside that a third, which the swelling of the wood had almost swallowed, but which she took for a Y. Claire sat back on her heels. The skirting of a housekeeper's room did not carry the initials of the house. Housekeepers' rooms were the plainest rooms in any building, and this one had been plain when it was built. A fireplace of common brick, a floor of unwaxed board, a press bed built cheap against the damp. Nobody set letters of brass into the skirting of such a room. The letters belonged to a hall, a library, a study, a room with paneling above them and a carpet below. She rose and stood with the blanket at her throat and looked at the room properly for the first time. The ceiling was low, as a housekeeper's ceiling should be, but the beam that crossed it did not sit where a beam should sit. It ran the wrong way against the joists above, thicker than the room needed, and its underside had once been painted. She saw the ghost of a color where soot had not quite covered it. The fireplace, though of common brick, sat in an alcove whose stone jambs were older and finer than the brick, as if a good chimney-piece had been ripped out and a mean one bricked in. The window was set too high for a servant to see out of easily, but it faced south, and no one bricked a south window into a housekeeper's room without a reason. Claire did not act on any of it. She had learned in a marble drawing room in London that a thing understood too early was a thing said too soon. She put on her boots. She built the fire up. She set the kettle back on the bar. She washed her hands and face in what was left of the boiled water and dried them on the hem of her shift. She looked once more at the 3 brass letters in the skirting, and then she took the broom and swept the dust of 30 years out of the corner and out of the door. And she went to look at the rest of the house by daylight. The rest of the house by daylight was worse than the rest of the house by candlelight, and better than she had feared. Claire walked from room to room in the ground floor of the central block with the broom in one hand and a candle stub in the other, though she did not light it. She counted rooms. She counted windows. She counted doors that opened and doors that had swelled shut in their frames. She counted places where the ceiling had come down and places where it hung, waiting to come down, and places where, against all expectation, the plaster was sound. She counted 7 fireplaces before she stopped counting. She found the great hall she had entered by, the long east parlor with its shrouded furniture, a dining room whose table was still laid with tarnished plate under a linen shroud, gray as smoke, a library whose shelves stood empty, and whose floor was scattered with what had once been books and was now a black wet mulch, a music room with a harpsichord whose lid had rotted through, and, at the north end of the central block, a room she took at first for another parlor and then, standing in the doorway, understood to be something else. It was a room without windows, or rather, it had been a room with windows, and the windows had been bricked from the inside. She saw the ragged brick where the plaster had fallen from the reveals. It had a hearth on the north wall, wider than any hearth she had yet seen in the house, built of a pale stone almost yellow in the gray light that leaked in from the corridor. Above the hearth, where an overmantel should have been, there was only a rectangle of raw plaster where something heavy had been prized off and taken away. The floor was flagged, not boarded. In the center of the flags lay a fall of soot from the chimney, black as pitch and cold, and in the fall of soot were the small, clear prints of an animal that had walked in and out again. Claire stood in the doorway a long moment, mined the west cellar, mined the chapel floor, and when the year turns, look under the north hearth. She did not go in. She marked the room in her memory with the north hearth in it, and she went on. She was in the passage on her way back to the housekeeper's room when the animal that had made the prints came out of a shadow ahead of her and stopped. It was a cat, lean, brindled brown and gray like a bit of bark, with one ear notched and eyes the color of old brass. It did not run. It looked at her the length of the passage, and when she did not move, it sat down on the flags and set its tail neatly round its paws and waited. Claire crouched. She held out the back of her hand. The cat considered the hand for the space of 3 slow breaths, and walked to it, and pressed the flat of its skull once against her knuckles, and walked on past her toward the housekeeper's room and the fire. Claire followed the cat back to the fire. She named it nothing that morning, and it required no name. It sat on the warm flags beside the hearth and washed its face while she made a second kettle of hot water and ate the other half of the loaf. When she went out into the drive to wheel back the barrow to Harding, the cat came to the door and watched her go. When she came back an hour later with a second barrow load from the village, a scrubbing brush, a bucket, a bar of yellow soap, a pound of tea, a screw of sugar, a hank of tallow candles, and a small iron trivet Mrs. Peake had pressed on her without accepting a coin. The cat was in the housekeeper's window, framed among the ivy, waiting. That day, Claire scrubbed the flags of the housekeeper's room. The next day, she scrubbed the entrance hall. The day after that, she began on the long east parlor, taking down the gray sheets one by one and folding them into a pile to be washed at the pump. Under the sheets, she found a chaise with the horsehair coming out of it, 2 card tables inlaid with a wood she did not know, a set of 6 chairs whose gilding was black, but whose frames were sound, and standing against the far wall, a long case clock whose face was engraved with a moon and a sun, and whose pendulum was gone. She wound none of it. She only uncovered and looked, and covered again with clean sheets when she had washed them. A week passed. Claire's hands went first raw and then hard. Her palms cracked. Mrs. Peake, when Claire came down for flour, gave her a little pot of goose grease and said to rub it in at night. Claire did, and the cracks closed. Harding lent her a billhook and would not take a shilling for the loan. With the billhook, Claire cut back the blackthorn along the drive until a cart could have come up it without losing its paint, though no cart came up it. She cleared a path from the kitchen door to the well. She found the well capped with a rotten board and covered it with a new one Harding's boy sawed from a plank. She cleared a path from the kitchen door to the wood store and found the wood store empty. She cleared a path from the kitchen door to the walled garden and stood at the door of the walled garden and did not go in because she was not ready yet to see what a walled garden untended for 30 years had made of itself. The cat came with her to every threshold. It walked at her heel on the drive. It sat on the mounting block while she cut brambles. It lay on the flags of whichever room she was scrubbing and watched her hands. When she carried a load of wet plaster out to the yard in her apron, the cat trotted beside her. When she stopped to press her back, the cat stopped and pressed its shoulder against her ankle. At night it slept on the oilskin at her feet. She fed it scraps of the loaf and, when she could, the head of a herring from the inn. She began to call it Ash, for the color of it and for the house, and it answered to Ash as if it had always been called so. Her hands, learning, began to tell her things her mind had not yet caught up with. The banister at the foot of the great stair, when she scrubbed it, gave back under the soap a carving finer than any banister on any house she had lived in. The oak leaf pattern she had taken for provincial work in candlelight turned out, in daylight and clean, to be the work of a master. Each leaf was different, each acorn cut with a separate small tenderness, and among the leaves, if she looked closely, she found small faces, a fox, a hare, an owl, a fish, hidden in the carving as a joke or a signature. She rubbed her thumb across an owl's face and felt the sharpness of a chisel 100 years cold. In the dining room, when she took down the shroud from the table, she found under the tarnish that the plate was not plate at all, but silver, hallmarked, heavy in the hand, 12 places set as if for a supper that had been called off between soup and fish. She counted the pieces. She washed 1 spoon in hot water and rubbed it with the corner of her apron until the crest came up. The crest was not the crest above the gatehouse arch. It was a different crest, older, cut in a different style, and it bore a motto she did not know. In the library, when she raked out the black mulch of what had been books, her rake caught on a corner of leather that was still leather. She knelt in the mulch and lifted out, whole and only damp, a small brown ledger no bigger than a prayer book. Its clasp rusted, but its pages, when she prized the clasp, dry inside the boards. She did not open the pages then. She set the ledger on the housekeeper's mantel to dry, and the cat, on the flags, watched her set it there without blinking. And each night, when the fire was low and ash was curled at her feet, and the shutter above tapped its 1-2, 1-2, Claire lay awake a while thinking of the 3 brass letters in the skirting of the housekeeper's room, and of the wide pale hearth in the windowless room at the north end, and of a spoon with the wrong crest on it. And she did not yet know what the pattern meant. She only knew there was a pattern, and that the man on the drive had known there was a pattern, and that the Duke in his marble drawing room had not. The year turned quietly at Ashby Hall. Frost came before Christmas and stayed. The lime avenue turned to iron. The ivy on the west end went stiff and silver. Every morning Claire broke the ice on the well before drawing water. She had by then made the housekeeper's room warm and the kitchen usable, cleared 3 chimneys, patched the boards of the great stair, and moved the ledger from the mantel to the top of her trunk, where she read it a page at a time by candlelight after ash had settled. The ledger was a household book kept in a careful woman's hand from a time before Claire's grandmother was born. It listed servants by name, wages by quarter, and at the top of each page, in the same careful hand, the words Ashby Hall, for the family of Ashby. Not for the Duke's family, not for any cousin of any lord, for the family of Ashby. And on a page toward the back, folded once and pressed flat, a small drawing of a floor with a hearth marked, and beside the hearth an arrow, and beside the arrow the word there. On the night the year turned, Claire took a candle and a poker and went to the north room. Ash came with her, tail low, ears forward. She knelt on the flags before the wide, pale hearth. She swept the fall of cold soot into her apron and carried it out. She came back and set her palm on each flag in turn. One flag, the second from the left, rocked under her hand. She fetched the billhook, worked its point into the joint, and levered. The flag came up in 2 pieces, sighing dust. Beneath it lay a hollow no bigger than a bread oven, lined with dry brick, and in the hollow, wrapped in oiled linen gone the color of tea, an iron strong-box the length of her forearm. Claire lifted the box out. She set it on the flags and looked at it. She did not open it there. She carried it back to the housekeeper's room, set it on the hearthstone where the fire could see it, and knelt with the poker to break the rust. The lock gave on the 3rd try. Inside, in fragments as the candle moved, she saw a folded parchment sealed in green wax, a bundle of letters tied in tape once read, a smaller ledger bound in black, a survey done in brown ink on linen paper, showing the estate and a broad-shaded band running under the west fields marked Ironstone, workable, and at the bottom, a settlement written in a lawyer's hand and signed by 3 witnesses, leaving Ashby Hall and every acre and every mineral within its bounds to the female line of the Ashby house, in perpetuity, so long as any daughter of that line should live. Claire read the settlement twice. She read the name of the last daughter named in it. It had been her mother's name. She sat back on her heels. Ash, on the oilskin, opened one eye and closed it. The fire moved. Claire understood, all at once, and without any lifting of the heart, that the Duke had given away what had not been his to give, and had given it back to the house it had been taken from, and had thought he was giving her nothing. She folded the settlement, laid it in the box, closed the lid, and set the box under her pillow. She said nothing aloud. She sat by the fire until the candle guttered, and then she slept. 3 nights later, the snow came. It came without warning at dusk, thick and sideways, and by midnight the drive was gone, and the lime avenue was one white wall. Claire had banked the fire and lain down when she heard the knocking. It was not the shutter. It was a hand, weak and steady, on the great front door. She took the candle and ash at her heel and went through the black entrance hall. She drew back the bolt. Snow blew in, and with the snow a man on his knees, and behind him a woman with a bundle held under her cloak, and behind her a boy of about 9 holding the bridle of a small pony whose flanks were shaking. The man raised his face. He was blue about the mouth. He said, "We are lost, mistress. The child." The woman said nothing at all. The bundle in her cloak was a baby, and the baby was not yet blue. Claire brought them in. She put her shoulder to the door and shut out the snow. She led them through the passage to the housekeeper's room, where the fire still lived, and she built it up with the last of the coal and 2 of the split limes Harding's boy had brought. She sat the woman by the hearth with the baby against her chest, wrapped her father's oilskin cloak round both of them, and put the boy on the flags at his mother's feet with ash beside him. The man she made lie down on the oilskin, and she rubbed his hands between her own until feeling returned. She warmed milk from her small stock. She softened bread in it. She fed the boy first and the man second, and would not eat herself. The baby, when its mother opened the cloak, was breathing. The man was a carter from 2 valleys over, going home to his wife's mother with the year's small money in his coat. He had missed the road at the crossroads and taken the sunken lane, and the pony had refused the drifts, and he had seen the light of Claire's window from the gatehouse arch. He said all of this slowly, 1 sentence at a time, between spoons of soaked bread. The woman said, "God bless the house." The boy said nothing and slept with his head on ash. In the small hours, the wind changed and threw itself against the west end of the roof. Something above the passage gave with a long, slow, tearing sound, and cold air poured down the stair. Claire took the candle and went to see. A rafter over the empty music room had gone at last under the weight of snow, and the ceiling below it had come down in one soft, gray fall. Water was already coming in on the boards. If it reached the east wall, it would reach the housekeeper's chimney breast, and behind the housekeeper's chimney breast, in a hollow she had scraped out that morning against the damp, lay the iron strongbox. Claire stood a moment on the stair with the candle. She thought of the box. She thought of the woman with the baby against her breast, and the man asleep on the oilskin, and the boy asleep against the cat. She went back down. She did not move the box. She fetched the bucket and the 2 washing tubs and set them under the worst of the drips in the passage. And she took her father's second cloak from the trunk and laid it over the woman and the baby. And she sat up in the doorway of the housekeeper's room with the poker across her knees until dawn. By dawn, the wind had fallen and the snow had stopped. The man could stand. The woman could walk. The baby was pink. Claire gave them the last of her bread and half her tea and a twist of paper, and she went out with the man to dig the pony free of the drift by the gatehouse. When they were gone down the lane, with the boy waving from the pony's back and the woman turning once to look at the house, Claire stood in the arch under the word Ashby and understood a second thing without lifting her heart: that the house was hers to keep, and that keeping it meant this, and not the box under the pillow. She went back inside. She fed Ash. She climbed to the music room with a hammer, 3 nails, and a length of tarred canvas Harding had sold her in October for $1, and she began to close the roof against the next weather that came. The carter came back on the 3rd day after the thaw with his brother and a cart of split ash. He would not take money. He set the wood by the kitchen door in a stack as high as Claire's shoulder, tipped his cap to ash on the sill, and said his wife had told the story at the inn in his own village, and at 2 more between. By the end of that week, a man Claire did not know rode up from the crossroads with a bundle of slates roped behind his saddle, and said Mrs. Peake had sent him, and that the price was settled. A woman from a cottage on the far side of the churchyard walked up the drive with a basket of eggs under a cloth, and left it on the step without knocking. A boy came with a message from Harding that a man in the next parish had a stack of seasoned oak boards going for the price of the cartage, and would Miss Cole like them held. The village had turned. It turned slowly, as villages do, without apology and without announcement. The woman over the hedge no longer spoke of wagers. The man at the smithy no longer spoke of the first frost. The child by the churchyard wall was told, when it asked again, that Claire was the lady up at Ashby who had kept a family alive in the snow, and the child, this time, was not hushed. In the second week after the thaw, a small dark carriage came up the drive with a solicitor inside it. He was a spare man of about 50 in a black coat, with spectacles on a black ribbon and a leather case on his knee. And he had come from the county town on his own hire because a letter had reached him from a clerk in London who had once served Claire's mother's people. His name was Mr. Bardwell. He sat in the housekeeper's room with the fire between them and ash on the flags, and he read the parchment sealed in green wax, then the smaller ledger, then the settlement in the lawyer's hand, and last the survey with the shaded band under the west fields. He read each twice. He set them down on the hearthstone. He took off his spectacles and polished them on a square of linen. "Miss Cole," he said, "this is sound." Claire waited. Sound in every particular. The settlement holds, the line holds, the mineral rights were never severed. He folded the linen. Whatever was signed over to you in London was signed by a man who did not know what he was signing away. He gave you a shell, as I understand it. He gave you the kernel with it. "I know," Claire said. Mr. Bardwell looked at her a long moment, and something like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, and he inclined his head. "Then I shall put it beyond question in writing, and lodge the writing where it cannot be lost." He did. Within a month, a surveyor came from the county town, and after him a mining agent from the north, and after him a land agent for a company that laid rail. None of them laughed at the drive or at the hole in the music room roof. Each of them left a card on the housekeeper's mantel beside the ledger, and Claire kept the cards in the order in which they had come. Ridley rode up in March on the bay horse. He did not dismount at first. Then he did dismount. He held his hat in both hands at the door of the housekeeper's room, and said his lordship had had a letter from his cousin the Duke, and wished Miss Cole to know that Marsden and Ashby were neighbours, and hoped to be good ones, and that if a cart were ever needed for anything at all, at any hour, Marsden's men were down the hill, and would come at a walk. Claire thanked him. She did not offer tea. Ridley put his hat back on and rode away, and this time he did not whistle. The Duke himself came in April, when the limes were greening. He came in a plain coach, not the one Claire remembered from London, and he came without his mother and without his wife. He stood in the entrance hall in his travelling coat with his hat in his hand, and looked up at the brass chandelier, which Claire had lowered on its rusted chain, cleaned, and hung again on a new one. He looked at the banister she had scrubbed to bare wood. He looked at the coign of daylight now grown to a whole window where the boards had been prized off. He asked, in a voice she did not remember him using in London, whether he might sit. Claire showed him to a chair in the long east parlour, under the sound part of the ceiling. He sat. He said he had come to ask her, as a matter of family and of honour, whether she would sell Ashby Hall back to him at any price she cared to name. He said the word please twice. He did not look at her when he said it. Claire looked at him and thought of a marble drawing room and 80 guests and a deed unrolled like a joke. She felt no heat. She felt instead the weight of the house behind her, and ash against her ankle, and the carter's wife turning once in the arch to look back. "No," she said. "Thank you." The Duke bent his head. He sat a moment longer, then he stood, and he bowed to her, properly, as he had not bowed in London, and he went out to his coach, and he was driven away down the avenue of limes, and he did not come again. That evening Claire walked out to the gatehouse arch under the word Ashby. The sun was low behind the west end of the roof, which was closed now with new slates the color of a wet stone, and the light came through the tunnel of limes in long, soft bars and lay on the flags of the drive. Ash walked at her heel. From the village below, a bell rang the hour, and did not ring for her, and did not ring against her, only rang. Mrs. Peake was at the lodge gate with a basket, waiting, patient. Harding was mending the second oak door with his boy, and the tap of the mallet came steady through the still air. A rook lifted from a chimney and settled on another. Claire stood in the arch with her reddened hands loose at her sides and looked up the drive at Ashby Hall. And she said quietly, more to Ash than to anyone, "They gave me a shell. I made it a house." She stood there until the sun went behind the roof and the bars of light on the flags went blue, and then she turned and walked back up the drive toward the lit window of the housekeeper's room, and the cat went with her, and the door she had mended closed behind her without complaint. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, and for walking the long lane up to Ashby with her. If the quiet stubbornness of a woman who would not let a house be forgotten stayed with you, leave a like. Tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Another lantern is already lit, and another door is waiting to be pushed open. Until then, be well and be kind to the things the world has set aside.